In baseball, you don't know nothing. Why buy good luggage? You only use it when you travel. And if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else. Yogi Berra. God, I love his quotes. They're the absolute bestest.
From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I am not here to waste your time, I got a long one coming at you tonight. Yes, that is what she said. So, with that maximally minimal amount of preambular prattling having been duly dispensed with, we present here for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to Baseball Outside the United States. Prologue: The Strange Failure of American Ownership. Tonight, while I am sitting here talking to you fine people, there is a baseball game being played between the United States and the Dominican Republic that, on paper, may be one of the finest assemblages of baseball talent ever gathered on one field at one time. A game so rich in elite pitching, hitting, speed, power gloves, and institutional baseball memory that if you described the rosters to a baseball friend from 1955, he would assume you were talking about a work of speculative fiction. And I will not be watching it because the blast radius sleeps for no man, because instead we are going to discuss something even more interesting than the game itself, which is the peculiar historical fact that baseball may be the only major American invention that the rest of the world accepted, internalized, transformed, and then proceeded to care about in ways that often look more emotionally committed than the place that invented it. America, after all, has exported many things. We exported jazz, we exported Hollywood, we exported blue jeans, Coca Cola, aircraft carriers, and the regrettable habit of putting cheese on things that previously had no cheese on them. But baseball occupies a category all its own because baseball did not simply travel abroad as a consumer product, it traveled as a social ritual. And once it arrived elsewhere, people did not merely imitate the American version. They took the rules, kept the geometry, preserved the foul lines and 90 feet between the bases, and then they built entirely different emotional civilizations up around it. That is why a baseball game in Tokyo does not sound like a baseball game in Boston. This is why a home run in Seoul produces a civic noise resembling a military parade with brass accompaniment. That is why in Santo Domingo the crowd behaves less like spectators than like co authors of the evening's entertainment. Same game, same dimensions, same count, same strike zone, same 90 feet, same 3 outs, but different assumptions about what the game is for, what the crowd owes to the game, and what the game owes to the nation watching it. And that is the first thing Americans often misunderstand when they speak casually about international baseball, as though it were merely our game being played by foreigners who happen to buy the equipment. It is not that at all. Baseball abroad is often recognizably descended from the American original, but no more subordinate to it than Spanish is subordinate to Latin. At some point, the offspring becomes its own civilization. Which brings us to one of the funniest facts in modern sports. The World Baseball Classic was created in part by Americans who quietly assumed that once the thing existed, the United States would naturally dominate it forever, because after all, who else owns baseball? And then the tournament began, and America immediately discovered that ownership papers had not been issued. The United States did not even make it to the semifinals in the first edition of this tournament in 2006. Japan won the thing, and then Japan won it again, and then the Dominican Republic won it the next time without losing a game. America finally won one in 2017, and even now it enters every tournament with the uncomfortable awareness that half the bracket regards the event as a national cause, while American fans are still debating whether March baseball counts emotionally in the same way that October baseball does. That imbalance matters, because international sports are often won first by whichever side decides that it matters more before the anthems are played. And in a strange way, that first American failure may have been the best thing that ever happened to it in this tournament. Had the United States won the first three editions, the old critics would have been proven right. Another American vanity exercise with flags attached. Instead, the first thing the world saw was Korea and Japan treating a semifinal like statecraft, and Cuba and the Dominican Republic treating the other semifinal like inherited family business conducted under stadium lights. I know because I was there. In one semifinal, I watched East Asian baseball culture arrive in my own hometown, carrying drums and chants and disciplined, synchronized expectations and emotional voltage unlike anything that is ordinarily found in an American ballpark outside of October. In the other semifinal, I watched Caribbean baseball culture arrive carrying joy, argument, movement, rhythm, noise, and the cheerful refusal to separate sport from celebration. And the great educational value of seeing both in one afternoon was that it permanently cures a person of the childish belief that baseball abroad is merely baseball with subtitles. America invented baseball. That much is true enough for historical shorthand. But invention and possession are not the same thing. Britain invented parliamentary government, and yet Westminster no longer owns every parliament on earth, perhaps not even its own. Jim Eagle, remember to put a rim shot in after that line when you edit the video, please. Italy invented opera, but Vienna had certain opinions. The French invented cuisine, and then discovered that everybody else had kitchens too. We invented baseball. The world accepted delivery, signed for the package, discarded half the instructions, and built cathedrals with the remaining lumber. Chapter 1, the first missionaries without a mission board. The earliest spread of baseball outside the United States did not occur because Washington devised a strategic cultural export plan, nor because somebody in the 19th century concluded that global influence required a bat and ball doctrine. It happened because Americans, once they had invented a game they liked, carried it with them accidentally the same way they carried tobacco habits, business ledgers, Protestant anxieties, and opinions about railroads. Sailors played it in ports because sailors, when given empty ground and spare time, will invent either card games or trouble, and baseball was the healthier of the two options. Merchants carried gloves and bats because Americans abroad in the late 19th century had not yet developed the modern instinct that leisure equipment ought to remain at home. Teachers introduced it in foreign schools because schoolyards always become laboratories for cultural transfer. Missionaries, perhaps without fully intending it, introduced baseball wherever young people could be persuaded that organized recreation did not threaten their salvation. And so baseball reached foreign soil before America itself had fully decided what baseball was supposed to mean nationally. And this is an important point, because later generations imagined baseball as though it emerged fully dressed in patriotic symbolism, wrapped in star-spangled bunting, attended by brass bands, already carrying the moral burden of national identity. In reality, the first baseball exported abroad was simply a game Americans liked to play because it fit the available land, required enough people to feel communal, and allowed just enough standing around for conversation between moments of action. Cuba encountered baseball astonishingly early, partly because Cuban students and merchants moved frequently between Havana and American cities, especially New Orleans and New York, carrying home not only political ideas, but recreational habits. In fact, baseball arrived in Cuba before many parts of rural America had fully standardized the rules themselves, which means that one of the first places outside the continental United States to adopt baseball seriously did so while Americans themselves were still arguing over local variations. Japan's case was even more revealing because baseball arrived there not through conquest, not through occupation, but through pedagogy. American educators in the Meiji period introduced it in schools, and the Japanese immediately recognized something Americans themselves had only half articulated, that baseball was not merely amusement, but discipline disguised as amusement. A game of repeated practice, assigned roles, delayed gratification, hierarchy, precision, and ritual repetition, qualities that fit neatly into a society already disposed to admire such things. That is why baseball took root abroad most successfully, not where Americans shouted the loudest about it, but where local society saw something in the game that reflected themselves back to themselves. This is the mistake Americans often make when discussing cultural exports generally. We imagine that because we sent something outward, its adoption must reflect admiration for us. Often it reflects something much more complicated. Foreign societies adopt what they find useful, adaptable, or symbolically convenient, and then they proceed to make it theirs without asking permission, which is why baseball flourished abroad, not because America convinced everyone that baseball represented freedom, but because other peoples looked at 9 innings and found within them structures that they recognized: order, suspense, patience, hierarchy, release, collective participation, and occasionally glorious disorder. In other words, baseball succeeded abroad for the same reason many durable institutions succeed anywhere, because it proved capable of speaking several cultural languages without changing its grammar. And once that happened, once baseball ceased being merely American equipment in foreign hands, the next stage became inevitable. Americans began deliberately touring abroad to demonstrate the game, at which point they discovered that exporting baseball intentionally was much messier than exporting it accidentally. Chapter 2: Barnstorming as Foreign Policy Conducted by Lunatics. In the first phase of international baseball involved Americans casually carrying the game overseas in luggage. Then the second phase involved Americans deciding to export it on purpose, which immediately introduced the sort of chaos that often appears whenever 19th century confidence collides with 19th century logistics. Because once baseball men discovered that foreigners would pay to see American professionals, somebody naturally concluded that organized overseas tours would be both profitable and civilizational. Those two words, profitable and civilizational, have launched many badly managed enterprises in human history. The earliest overseas baseball tours possessed all the characteristics one would expect from ambitious ventures organized by men who were excellent at baseball and considerably less excellent at scheduling, accounting, nutrition, diplomacy, and quite often, maritime realism. Teams traveled enormous distances under arrangements that often appeared to have been drafted on hotel stationery the previous afternoon. Equipment arrived late. Opponents were improvised. Exhibition schedules changed constantly. Promoters overpromised attendance, undercounted expenses, and occasionally seemed surprised that oceans require time in order to cross. And yet the tours continued because they generated fascination everywhere they went. There was something inherently theatrical about Americans arriving in foreign capitals carrying gloves and uniforms and self-confidence, proposing that local crowds should devote an afternoon to watching a sport that many had barely encountered before. It was half athletic event, half cultural demonstration, half accidental comedy. Yes, that is 3 halves, but so were many of these tours. The players themselves often behaved like traveling ambassadors who had not yet been informed that they were, in fact, ambassadors. Some took the role seriously enough to explain the game patiently. Others treated the journey as an extended inconvenience, interrupted by occasional applause. A few seemed to have required foreign customs with the same baffled suspicion that farm animals reserve for loud machinery. But the remarkable thing is that even when the tours were shambolic, and they frequently were, the game still landed, because baseball contains one advantage that all exportable sports envy. It becomes visually intelligible before it becomes intellectually understood. Even if you don't yet know the infield fly rule, and half or more of America remains proudly committed to not knowing the infield fly rule, you can still grasp immediately that a ball has been struck, that men are running, that other men are trying to prevent their advancement, and that some form of organized tension is underway. And once foreign audiences grasped the visible grammar, local imagination did the rest. The Americans often assumed they were displaying superiority. In many places, they were actually planting raw material that would later be refined beyond anything those tourists anticipated. Because what the barnstormers thought they were delivering as spectacle often arrived instead as blueprint. And nowhere would that become clearer than in Japan, where American baseball tours in the decades before the Second World War would be received not merely as entertainment, but as something closer to a national apprenticeship. Chapter 3, Babe Ruth arrives, and Japan decides this is serious. By the time American baseball reached Japan in its most theatrical pre-war form, the country had already spent decades proving that it was not merely willing to adopt foreign institutions, but unusually gifted at absorbing them, systematizing them, and returning them to the world in a form more disciplined than the original. Railways, naval doctrine, constitutional theory, industrial methods. Japan had been doing this since the Meiji era. Baseball simply turned out to be one more imported system that fit comfortably into a society already inclined to admire repetition, hierarchy, precision, and ritualized excellence. So when the MLB All-Stars arrived in 1934, led by a couple of first-generation German Americans named Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, try and fit that one into your 20th century cultural bingo card. The Americans believed they were bringing celebrity. And they weren't wrong, because even today, when pollsters ask people in other countries to name the names they most closely identify with Americanity, the top three names are always the same: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Babe Ruth. And is that fact the most deliciously American fact in the whole wide world? Well, that's not for me to say, but spoiler alert, yes. Yes, it is. Japan understood the magnitude of that celebrity, but they interpreted the event as something larger. A ceremonial encounter with the nation that had invented the game. More than 500,000 people turned out in Tokyo simply to greet the visiting players, which is not the sort of reception ordinarily produced by a nation that considers itself to be only casually interested. And one must appreciate the contrast in temperament. Americans, even when famous, often behave abroad as though fame itself is luggage that they are obliged to carry. Ruth arrived with all of the usual Ruth qualities: appetite, swagger, theatricality, and the unmistakable air of a man who understood perfectly well that he had become larger than baseball. How many hot Japanese chicks did he culturally enrich by the end of the tour? Well, reports vary, but he was Babe Goddamn Ruth, so we can be assured the number is commensurate with his legend, I think, because it wasn't just on the ball field that the Babe cared about having the biggest numbers, by golly. Japan received him not merely as an athlete, but almost as a visiting industrial wonder, which stands to reason, because how can you get that drunk, eat that much food, have that much sex, and still be that much better than everybody else at your chosen profession? Well, by being Babe Goddamn Ruth. That is how. The games themselves mattered less than the symbolic transaction that was underway. American players were demonstrating technique, but Japanese spectators were studying method. Americans saw exhibition. Japanese organizers saw institutional possibility. That difference explains much of what happened next. Because while the Americans departed believing they had staged a successful goodwill tour, Japan was already moving towards something much more durable: the construction of baseball not merely as imported entertainment, but as a domestically rooted structure of discipline, school identity, corporate affiliation, and eventually, national habit. And there's a wonderfully strange footnote attached to that tour, because among the American players present was Moe Berg, a backup catcher of modest major league distinction, whose enduring historical importance lies not in his batting average, but in the fact that he was quietly gathering intelligence while pretending to be merely another ball player. He climbed a Tokyo hospital roof and filmed industrial districts that later acquired very obvious military relevance. Thus, even before war arrived, baseball and geopolitics were already sharing luggage, which is perhaps fitting because baseball abroad often moved along the same routes as diplomacy, commerce, military presence, and national ambition, even when nobody admitted that openly. The larger lesson is this: Americans arrived thinking they were showing Japan a game. Japan characteristically treated the visit as an opportunity to study a system and then make it function along Japanese lines. And that is why, when later generations encounter Japanese baseball for the first time, what surprises them is not that the sport looks familiar, but that it appears to have been subjected to engineering tolerances. Chapter 4: The Awkward Geography of Sporting Conversion. Now comes the part that many people notice but few say out loud. If one examines the map of countries where baseball became one of the dominant national sports, one repeatedly stumbles into places where American military power, occupational authority, territorial control, naval presence, or direct intervention also happened to pass through during the 20th century. Not every case fits perfectly, and one should resist the temptation to force history into a conspiracy chart, but the pattern is too obvious to ignore. Japan became a baseball power after prolonged American post-war occupation, though the roots predated that occupation by some decades. South Korea built much of its baseball infrastructure during decades of close American military presence following war and Reconstruction. Puerto Rico did not merely encounter America, it became American territory. Panama spent generations living beside the canal and everything that came along with it. The Dominican Republic experienced repeated American interventions and occupations in the early 20th century. Cuba received baseball before formal imperial dominance, but certainly not outside broader American strategic gravity. One should immediately add an important caution. Military presence alone does not create sporting devotion. If that were true, every country hosting American bases would now be organizing infield drills. What military presence often does create is sustained institutional contact. Schools, ports, administrators, soldiers, merchants, transport networks, and repeated daily exposure. Sports travel through those channels easily because sports require neither translation treaties nor ideological conversion. A glove makes sense very quickly. But baseball survives only where local societies decide the game expresses something that is worth keeping. That is why the geopolitical observation should be treated not as the explanation, but as the delivery mechanism. The United States may have opened many of the doors through which baseball entered, but local culture decided whether the furniture was going to stay. In Japan, baseball attached itself to school identity and corporate prestige. In Korea, it fused with urban mass culture and public exuberance. In the Caribbean, it became inseparable from local joy, aspiration, and professional pathways. In Latin America, more generally, baseball acquired social meanings that often exceeded what the American original still retained, which is to say, empire may introduce the instrument, but it does not compose the music. And nowhere is that clearer than in Japan, where the game Americans exported eventually began sounding less like leisure and more like organized civic liturgy. Chapter 5: Why Japanese Baseball Sounds Like an Orchestra. The first American who attends a professional baseball game in Japan usually experiences a moment of cognitive delay because the field looks perfectly familiar, while the atmosphere sounds as though someone has merged a pennant race with a brass rehearsal and a disciplined civic festival. The dimensions are ordinary enough. The pitcher still toes the rubber 60 feet 6 inches away. The shortstop still drifts toward second base, depending on the count. The catcher still visits the mound while pretending not to stall. But the crowd behaves according to assumptions that are entirely different from those governing an American ballpark. In the United States, baseball crowds are episodic. They surge when prompted, retreat when bored, discuss concessions, wander for beverages, and often treat the 3 middle innings as an extended opportunity to inspect the architecture of the concourse. In Japan, the crowd appears to have arrived under instructions. Each player has a specific chant. Brass sections perform coordinated musical patterns. Entire seating blocks rise and move in synchronized rhythm. Offensive innings produce sustained organized participation, while defensive innings often quiet into attentive expectation as though everyone collectively understands when sound is a duty and when it is not. The emotional energy does not disappear between pitches. Rather, it is curated. This is not accidental exuberance. It is disciplined enthusiasm. And it reflects something profoundly Japanese: the idea that collective participation itself can be a form of excellence. American baseball inherited much of its stadium culture from vaudeville, county fairs, and later commercial entertainment. Japanese baseball inherited many of its habits from schools, regimented cheering traditions, and the broader social comfort and synchronized public behavior that accompany it. Thus, the same sport becomes two different civic experiences. An American fan attends a game and thinks this is wonderfully energetic. A Japanese fan attends a game and thinks, naturally, one contributes properly. Even the famous balloon releases, those absurdly beautiful moments when thousands of coordinated balloons rise together before an inning begins, express an instinct very unlike the American tendency towards spontaneous noise. The American crowd improvises emotion, the Japanese crowd organizes it. And there is something deeply fitting about the fact that a game Americans often describe as leisurely should in Japan become a demonstration that leisure itself may still possess a formal structure. Because Japan did not misunderstand baseball, it understood one possibility hidden inside baseball that Americans themselves had not yet fully explored: that repetition, anticipation, and collective rhythm can produce beauty if everyone agrees to participate in it seriously enough. Which is why a Japanese baseball game often feels less like watching 9 innings and more like attending a civic orchestra in which the score happens to include sacrifice flies. Chapter 6, Korea and the Professionalization of Joyful Noise. If Japanese baseball gives the impression that every cheer has been rehearsed by a committee determined to maintain dignity while permitting enthusiasm, Korean baseball begins from the opposite premise, namely that dignity is welcome so long as it does not interfere with volume. The first thing an American notices at a professional game in South Korea is that the crowd does not wait for the game to become exciting before behaving as though it already has. In the United States, a crowd usually reacts to developments: a double into the gap, a diving catch, a two-strike count in the late innings, a reliever entering with inherited trouble. In Korea, the emotional assumption appears to be that the game itself, by merely existing, has already justified organized celebration, which means the noise begins early, it stays constant, and it develops a structure of its own. There are cheer captains standing on platforms facing the crowd rather than the field, conducting chants with the seriousness of men directing troop movements. There are songs assigned not merely to teams, but to individual hitters. There are inflatable thundersticks being struck together in rhythms that somehow remain coordinated despite thousands of participants. There is drumming, call and response, melody, repetition, and the strange but undeniable impression that the crowd has accepted partial responsibility for manufacturing the momentum. And because Korean spectators have accepted that responsibility, silence becomes almost suspicious. The American baseball crowd contains long stretches of private conversation punctuated by bursts of common attention. The Korean baseball crowd behaves as though private conversation ought to wait until November. This produces one of the most delightful inversions in all of sports. Baseball, the game most frequently accused in America of moving too slowly for modern attention spans, becomes in Korea one of the loudest and most continuously animated public entertainments imaginable. But here again, the crowd culture reflects deeper national habits. Modern Korean public life is highly urban, highly social, highly participatory, and unusually comfortable with collective energy expressed openly. Sporting events naturally inherit those habits, so the baseball stadium becomes not merely a place where athletic events are observed, but a licensed zone for organized exuberance. And importantly, none of this means the baseball itself is secondary. Quite the opposite. Korean fans are often acutely knowledgeable, emotionally exacting, and perfectly capable of treating managerial incompetence as a civic grievance. They simply reject the American notion that expertise and noise should exist separately. Which is why Korean baseball often feels to American visitors like discovering that somebody has solved a problem they did not realize existed, namely, how to make every inning sound like the 7th inning stretch without anybody losing track of the count. And once one has experienced that, it becomes easier to understand why the first World Baseball Classic came as a shock to American audiences, because when Korean fans arrived in 2006, they did not arrive behaving like guests. They arrived behaving as though international baseball already belonged to everyone prepared to care loudly enough. Chapter 7, Caribbean baseball and the refusal to separate sport from life. If Japan organizes baseball and Korea amplifies baseball, the Caribbean reminds everyone that baseball was never meant to be emotionally sterile in the first place. To watch serious baseball in the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or Venezuela is to encounter a version of the game that has never accepted the American habit of pretending that visible emotional enjoyment must occasionally apologize for itself. Because in much of Latin baseball culture, the game is not cordoned off from ordinary human expression, it is continuous with it. There is music because why would there not be music? There is argument because argument is a part of life. There is laughter, movement, commentary directed toward the field, commentary directed toward the umpires, commentary directed toward relatives of umpires not presently in attendance, and a general refusal to treat baseball as though it were occurring inside a museum. The American game, particularly at its highest professional levels, has gradually become quieter in proportion to its wealth. Tickets became expensive, architecture became corporate, and portions of the live audience began behaving as though attendance were partly a premium seating transaction. In much of the Caribbean, baseball never entirely surrendered its older identity as communal event first and commercial event second. That is why a crowd in Santo Domingo may feel emotionally fuller than a larger crowd in a major American city. The point is not merely that people are louder, it is that more people regard participation as natural. And one must also recognize that in many Caribbean baseball societies, the game carries social meanings that Americans often underestimate. For generations, it has represented aspiration, mobility, national representation, neighborhood pride, and in some cases, one of the clearest visible routes by which local talent enters global recognition. That changes the emotional stakes. A double in winter ball is not merely a double. It may be a local affirmation that the neighborhood still produces excellence. A national team game is not merely sport. It becomes a compressed argument about dignity, visibility, and historical standing. This is why Caribbean fans bought into the World Baseball Classic instantly and completely. No persuasion was required. The concept already made sense. Of course, national baseball matters. Why would that require an explanation? And in 2006, when your humble correspondent watched the Cuba-Dominican semifinal in my own hometown, what struck me was not simply that the stadium was loud. Our postseason games are loud too, but that the noise possessed a different emotional texture altogether. Less episodic, less negotiated, less conditional. It didn't wait for television cues. The game belonged to the people already, and they behaved accordingly. Which is perhaps why so many American observers who first encounter Latin baseball abroad return saying some version of the same thing. I knew the rules, but I had forgotten how alive those rules could sound. Chapter 8, Mexico, Panama, and the baseball borderlands. And then there are the countries where baseball never entirely conquered the national imagination, but never surrendered its claim either. Places where the game lives in permanent coexistence with stronger rivals, stronger regional habits, or stronger competing identities. Mexico is perhaps the clearest example, because Mexico is geographically close enough to the United States to absorb baseball early and continuously, yet culturally distinct enough to insist that imported things must negotiate for relevance rather than simply assuming it. So baseball in Mexico became powerful without becoming universal. Northern Mexico embraced it heavily, partly through direct proximity to American commercial routes, partly through climate, and partly because regional identities there often overlapped naturally with baseball culture. Southern regions remained more firmly attached to football. The result is not a baseball nation in the singular sense, but a country containing very serious baseball provinces. And that provincial seriousness matters because Mexican baseball developed one of the most independent institutional identities anywhere in the hemisphere. Strong domestic leagues, local loyalty, stubborn traditions, and periodic refusal to behave merely as a feeder infrastructure for Major League Baseball. Mexican baseball often feels like a parallel republic, familiar enough to Americans, but resistant to full incorporation. Panama offers a different story because their baseball's spread cannot be separated from the history of the canal. For generations, the canal zone functioned as one of the great contact corridors of American presence abroad. Soldiers, engineers, administrators, merchants, workers, and all the social debris that follows permanent strategic infrastructure. Baseball arrived naturally because Americans arrived naturally, and once established, it proved to be highly durable. Panama's contribution to world baseball has often exceeded what outsiders might expect from a country of its size precisely because baseball embedded itself deeply enough to become ordinary. And that is the common trait in these so-called borderland baseball countries. The game survives best where it ceases to feel imported. Nobody sustains affection for a sport over generations merely because foreigners once recommended it to them. It must become local enough to produce memories, rivalries, heroes, arguments, and inherited cultural habits, which is why these countries matter so much to the larger story. They prove that baseball need not become the single dominant national sport in order to become culturally durable. It only needs enough local institutions willing to defend it against time. And by the time the World Baseball Classic arrived, all of those distinct baseball civilizations, Japanese precision, Korean noise, Caribbean vitality, Mexican stubbornness, Panamanian continuity, were finally asked to stand in one tournament and reveal themselves side by side. At which point, America learned something very useful about what the rest of the baseball world had become while it was busy assuming authorship still implied seniority. Chapter 9, when the World Baseball Classic became real faster everywhere else. The original objection to the World Baseball Classic in the United States was almost charming in its confidence. Many American critics in the early 2000s assumed the event would either fail entirely or succeed only as a kind of ceremonial confirmation that the United States remained baseball's natural sovereign. The tournament, in this view, would function less as a genuine competition than as an international exhibition politely arranged around an inevitable American victory. This prediction had one weakness. It required the rest of the baseball world to cooperate emotionally with American assumptions. And the rest of the baseball world had already moved on. When the first tournament opened in 2006, countries that had spent decades building baseball cultures of their own arrived treating it not as an exhibition, but as an overdue geopolitical argument conducted with lineup cards. Japan arrived with seriousness because national baseball seriousness required no explanation. South Korea arrived with organizational intensity and crowd energy that immediately altered the emotional temperature of every game they touched. Dominican Republic and Cuba arrived understanding instinctively that national baseball already belonged in the category of things that are worth treating with urgency. Meanwhile, the United States arrived looking faintly uncertain whether this counted as a tournament, an obligation, or a scheduling inconvenience. Which is why the first great gift the World Baseball Classic gave to itself was eliminating the United States before the semifinals in the first edition of the tournament. That was not a humiliation, it was institutional salvation. Because had America won immediately and easily, every original suspicion about the event being a vanity project would have been hardened into doctrine. Instead, the first edition produced exactly what legitimacy required. The inventor of the sport discovering that invention no longer guaranteed authority. And because I happened to attend both semifinals and the final in that inaugural tournament, I had the rare privilege of watching the event acquire credibility in real time. The Korea versus Japan semifinal felt unlike any baseball crowd most American spectators have ever encountered live. The game itself mattered, of course, but so did the organized emotional architecture that surrounded it. Songs, percussion, precision, crowd discipline, sustained volume, and the unmistakable sense that both fan bases had arrived already convinced that this tournament deserved full emotional investment. And then came the Cuba versus Dominican semifinal, which replaced orchestration with intensity of another kind entirely. Caribbean baseball at international stakes, where every inning seemed to contain several overlapping arguments about dignity, history, and inherited confidence. And what struck American baseball crowds, it was that they required no explanation for why this mattered. The Americans at that stage still partly needed persuading, the others did not, which is why the World Baseball Classic became globally real before it became fully American. International fans immediately recognized what the tournament offered, a rare stage where baseball nations could appear not as exporters of talent, but as authors of national style. America took longer, partially because American baseball had spent generations unconsciously treating international talent as evidence of domestic league supremacy rather than evidence of parallel baseball civilizations. But once repeated tournaments produced repeated evidence of American inconsistency, Japanese excellence, Caribbean ferocity, Korean resilience, Mexican credibility, Canadian stubbornness, the original assumption became impossible to maintain. The United States had not created a ceremonial empire, it had accidentally convened a parliament. And in that parliament, voting rights turned out to be widely distributed. Chapter 10: The country that invented baseball now shares it. This is the point at which American baseball history becomes difficult for Americans, because invention creates habits of ownership that sometimes outlive reality. Yes, the United States built modern professional baseball. Yes, it industrialized the league structure, monetized the schedule, standardized the mythology, exported the statistics, and taught half of the world how to argue about earned run average. But invention and permanent authorship are not identical things. The British invented association football and now routinely watch other countries explain it better than they can. The Americans are discovering the baseball equivalent of that, because the modern baseball world no longer behaves like a hierarchy with one unquestioned center. It behaves like a federation of styles. Japan offers discipline elevated into aesthetic principle. Korea offers collective joy engineered at stadium scale. The Caribbean offers emotional continuity between neighborhood and nation. Mexico offers durable regional independence. Panama offers strategic continuity born of geography. Canada offers quiet institutional persistence. The only baseball country capable of producing a major league crowd that sometimes appears ready to applaud politely until someone reminds them that the score is tied in the ninth inning and national dignity may require louder participation. Even Puerto Rico complicates American ownership because, although politically tied to the United States, its baseball culture long ago acquired its own accent, memory, and emotional grammar. And, crucially, every one of these places now exports not merely ball players, but baseball assumptions. A Japanese pitcher arrives in America bringing not simply velocity, but training habits that were shaped elsewhere. A Dominican shortstop arrives bringing instincts forged in another baseball economy. A Korean crowd at an international game alters what surrounding spectators consider normal. The direction of influence no longer runs one way, which means the old American instinct to imagine baseball abroad as merely imitation has become historically inaccurate. It is no longer imitation, it is co-authorship. America still possesses the richest league, the largest media machine, and the deepest archive of baseball self-regard. But the emotional future of the game increasingly depends on places where baseball still feels nationally urgent in ways that Americans only intermittently remember. And this is why the World Baseball Classic matters more each cycle. Not because it proves America can still win occasionally, which it can and did once, to the visible relief of people who had been sounding slightly anxious about it, but because every tournament demonstrates again that baseball now belongs fully to countries that learned it under radically different historical conditions and then made it unmistakably their own thing. That is not decline, that is maturity. A game becomes fully international the moment its inventor can no longer control the tone of the conversation. Baseball has reached that point, and perhaps that is a healthy thing, because a sport that began as an American pastime has become one of the rare American exports whose most persuasive modern argument is that other people improve the local pronunciation without damaging the grammar. Epilogue: why this is probably good for everyone. The simplest way to understand modern baseball is this: America gave the world a game. The world declined to return it in its original packaging. Some countries added drums, some countries added songs, some added winter leagues fierce enough to make ordinary spring training look emotionally underfunded. Some added tactical patience, some added civic noise, some added public dancing, and Canada added the useful reminder that baseball can coexist indefinitely with a national obsession involving ice and blunt instruments. And after a century of exports, tours, occupations, accidents, missionaries, merchants, soldiers, railroads, sugar contracts, newspapers, naval ports, migration routes, and televised tournaments, the result is a sport whose map now tells a larger story than the rule book does. The game still looks familiar everywhere, but nowhere does it mean exactly the same thing. Which is why the first pitch of an international baseball game now carries something the sport did not originally possess. Not merely competition, but comparison. And comparison, historically speaking, is where baseball becomes most interesting. And so we close the book on this week's field guide. And if we made it this far, that means the prompter didn't defeat me this week. So self high five for that. And it's time for me to stop speaking at this point. So thanks very much for your kind attention, ladies and gentlemen. I now convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.
Tactical nuke incoming!
Welcome to the Blast Radius this evening, folks. I'm not entirely certain what we've got on the plate this afternoon, but it's going to be about baseball. Now, while he was doing his soliloquy over here, and I was all bored and stuff, I decided to go poke up something on some AI and see what they had to say about it. And they delivered this, and the prompt was, write me a 2-minute monologue on the diaspora of baseball. That's it. They call it America's pastime, like it's a family heirloom locked in a dusty cabinet in Cooperstown. But if you want to see where the heart of the game is actually beating, you have to look at a map, and then you have to start drawing arrows. The diaspora of the diamond isn't just about scouts finding talent. It's about the game finding a home where it was never invited. It's in the dusty lots of San Pedro de Macroy, where the kids fielding grounders with cardboard milk cartons for gloves, dreaming of the lights of the Bronx. It's in the precision of a bullpen session in Tokyo, where the pitcher treats every delivery like a tea ceremony. Perfect, deliberate, and lethal. It's the sound of the drums' soul. It's the Pura Vida energy in Panama. It's a kid in Caraco who speaks 4 languages but understands the language of a 3-2 count better than any of them. Baseball isn't just spread, it migrated. It took the rhythm of the Caribbean, the discipline of the East, and the grit of the North, and it mashed them all together. We exported a game, and the world sent back a masterpiece. I like it.
Yeah, it's not bad. I like it too. And it was such an and also to the people in the chat, I am willing to accept live score updates. I feel like that monologue went on longer than I planned. It really went a hell of a long time, didn't it? But I feel like that was probably a 2.5, 3-inning monologue. So if there's been any scoring by now, please do let me know. I'm curious to, and I have a bit of a problem with rooting interest in this game. Obviously, I'm American and should be rooting for my own team, but on the Dominican side are both of the superstars from my hometown team. So what are you supposed to do about that? I'm not going to say I wish I was watching the game more than I wish I was here hosting the Blast Radius, because the Blast Radius trumps everything naturally. We all know that. But having said that, I am willing to accept live score updates if you want to toss them at me. God bless your heart, Scotty Waddles.
Scotty Waddles for the $5. And
we interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
Scotty Waddles is great.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks, buddy.
Yes, sir. Now, baseball. I actually like watching Japanese baseball, but it's not something I sit down and watch. It's something like if I happen to be like scrolling through my phone and having something on in the background for noise kind of thing, and I come across Japanese baseball, I might leave it on that channel kind of subconsciously. There's something soothing about it. Everything's in its place and done in proper order, much like a tea ceremony.
You know, oftentimes I prefer watching baseball games with foreign language commentary rather than American or English language commentary. And Japan is one of the cases where that applies. And I also, generally speaking, I much prefer listening to a ball game being called in Spanish rather than English. I just find Spanish broadcasters so much less annoying than the American kind. And they have, especially in the Spanish language, they just have such wonderful musicality in their sports broadcasting, just the way they called the big offense in the game, and not just in baseball, but in soccer, obviously too. Just that.
Yeah, they also have big personalities that do that type of thing. Ours are kind of holdovers from old radio shows. It's like bottom of the ninth, then we're going into the long stretch.
Yeah, and our broadcasters have less individual personality, it seems like, as the years go by, which is regrettable because the days when every team had its own quirky, unmistakably individual radio or TV announcer. Those were good days, and we should lament having lost those days. But in other countries, they still haven't lost that. Sometimes the play-by-play voice of the team is just as big of a star as anybody who's on the team, and that's an awesome, wonderful thing. That is how baseball transcends sport, or it's how any sport transcends sport and becomes ingrained into the local, regional, national culture. It's not just the game; it's all of the personalities that surround the game that people attach themselves to and decide, yeah, I want this to be part of my culture.
Right. This is football, but it's kind of the same spirit of the thing. Few years, like 20 years ago, our announcer, our local semi-famous football announcer, died suddenly. And for like a week, we had people just kind of randomly come in doing the different games and stuff, because he used to do all the games. And I can't remember what he was in the Department of Education locally, but he was like a freaking clerk or something. Like he wasn't anybody in particular. He just had a good voice. People like to talk to him, and they listen to the games on the radio, right?
Yeah.
His replacement ended up being a janitor at the high school. And
wow.
The way he ended up replacing him was he had a silly little thing that he would do. He had a bit that he would do in the middle of the previous guy's show, where it was just, a little banter back and forth. He'd come in and clean out the trash can, and they'd talk for a second during the halftime or whatever, right? And somebody offered him a spot to sit next to whoever was replacing the guy, and he came in and did the entire show, and the other person just sat around drinking beer and talking about the game. Like, it worked out absolutely flawlessly. And this man has been doing it for the past 20 years, and every year there's a parade, and he's one of the floats that goes through doing all of his catchphrases and everything. And I think it's one of the cutest little things a small town in Georgia could have.
Yeah, here in San Diego, when Jerry Coleman died, which I want to say it was in 2014. Yeah, because him and Tony Gwynn died the same year, so it was 2014. And that was a heavy blow. That was because he was probably the greatest legend of the team, even though he never played for it. Managed it 1 year. That was kind of a fun story. In 1980, the Padres were so bad that they decided the best thing they could do to improve attendance would be to bring their radio play-by-play man out of the booth and have him manage the team. That only lasted for 1 year, 1980, and then he went back up to the booth after that. But he wound up being here for over 35 years, and he was a legendary figure in his own right, not just in baseball. He was played about 10 years for the Yankees, was the MVP of the 1950 World Series, a Marine fighter pilot in World War II and Korea. So he flew with Ted Williams. Ted Williams and Jerry Coleman, the only Marine Corps fighter pilots in the major leagues, as Jerry Coleman would often be quick to tell people. But when Jerry Coleman died, that was, I'm not going to say it compared to Tony Gwynn's death. It sounds disrespectful to say that, but Jerry Coleman was about 90 years old, and Tony Gwynn was not. He's only in his early 50s, so that was a much more upsetting, much more tragic thing. But when Jerry Coleman died, it absolutely was something that caused a week of local mourning. He was the kind of person who becomes an institution who not every city and team ever gets to have one of those. And I feel bad for the cities that don't, because obviously it's very sad when they ultimately pass on and die, but to have been that beloved of a human institution for that long, to have your death cause the kind of effect and the kind of outpouring and the kind of, we are opening up the ballpark to have a memorial service, and 40,000 people are going to show up even though there's no game. That's a special thing in my view, and it's kind of like the thing you were just talking about.
Yeah. It's certain radio personalities or certain games kind of inspire certain types of personalities, but baseball does show how different those personalities can be expressed in different cultures. Uh, the the biggest difference is how connected the crowd is to more than the game, but the performance of individual players. In other countries, it's not uncommon for the kid's bedroom to have two or three different players' posters on the wall, and you almost never see that in America anymore. It's rappers and TikTok people and stuff like that end up on kids' walls nowadays, and that's
Yeah.
there's something missing, and because baseball does another thing, it shows meritocracy at work. In baseball, if you are good, you will get the respect you deserve because you're that good.
Yes.
However, you can be drummed out of the league. So there's that.
And it's also possible to carve out a perfectly good, respectable career for yourself if you're only good at one thing and terrible at all the other things. that's that's another great thing about baseball is that it breeds such specialization.
Sure.
You know,
I
you,
mean,
you
I
can
guess
be
that's true.
you can. It's not really true as much now as it used to be. It's much more difficult now to be a light hitting backup middle infielder who has a job every year for 15 years just because he's a great glove man and a good presence in the clubhouse. You know, you kind of be able to need to be able to handle the stick more today than you used to, but that's just because of changing trends and changing priorities in the number crunchers who run the game. And I'm not to say
Tell you,
whether
one of the big changes that came, and what you're talking about now is bat performance over glove performance being something that's more desired nowadays, comes almost directly from, and I can't remember the dude's name, but they made a movie about it called Moneyball.
Billy Bean,
What was
yeah,
his name?
Billy Bean,
Billy
Oakland
Billy
A's.
Bean.
Oh,
He
sorry,
he
Sacramento
bas-
A's, future Las Vegas A's.
he basically AI baseball and didn't convince somebody that the AI knew what they was doing, except instead of AIing it, he was a nerd with a slide rule
Yes,
and some
and
really
be, and
thick
be,
glasses.
yeah, and because he had such great success for a period of a few years, success that the institutional baseball people felt like he had no business having. That had the result that everybody else in Major League Baseball adopted his same approach, and so that is now the only real approach that exists. And
Well,
so,
what he did that was different primarily is rather than trying to get the top talent, he traded top talent picks for high second and third tier talent that were younger, right? That would have the ability to grow into the space. And so because they were all younger and less proven, they were able to come in and form a team instead of each one of them being a debutante or some kind of freaking blah blah.
yeah, but it winds up being a real devil's bargain because each time you produce a high performing player in that system, you're still the Oakland A's, so you're not going to have any chance of signing that guy to a long term contract. So you got to flip him for more prospects before the 6 year mark before he becomes eligible for free agency, and that
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 was the
becomes
entire point of it.
yeah, but that becomes a thing that really wears on a fan base after a certain number of years. That every time they see a guy come up and start to do well, they know he's going to be out the door in the next year or two, and that's a really dispiriting thing for a local community. And of course, obviously, it led up to their team losing town, and I understand how much that sucks, and it's impossible to say how badly you feel for Oakland when they got good support for 50 years in the worst stadium in the history of North America, and the owner just couldn't wait to get the fuck out of there and go to Vegas. So, which of course the same thing happened with the Raiders, and so now Oakland has nothing, and that sucks because Oakland used to be an awesome sports town. And as much as I used to hate the Raiders, because I was part of that whole tribal AFC West thing before my team left town, you still can't help but feel bad for their fans and the A's fans and even the Warriors fans. They used to play in Oakland too. They moved across the bay to San Francisco because nobody wants to play in Oakland. But that's just the way this shit goes. Everybody winds up in LA or Vegas.
Back to Billy Beane. What he did was scout talent that the numbers suggested would be better later than they are now. And so when they did ripen and become the players that they potentially could be with a good coach, they were able to trade that talent for talent at either equal or better than that is yet again ripening into the position. And at this point, because these are yet again younger players that have suggestive numbers, the trade-off would be 1 for 2 rather than just a straight trade, because you're trading for quote unquote nobodies, but these are nobodies that have excellent stats. You're getting 2 of them.
The thing that Billy Beane did that was really outside of the box for the time was he said, I don't give a shit about batting average. I give a shit about on-base percentage. If you get your ass on first base, I don't care if you got there from a single or a walk. And I don't care if you look like a pro athlete. I don't care if you've got a big ass or a fucking beer gut or a double chin. If you can get on base 35% of the time, we want you on the Oakland Athletics. And that was
we want you on a starting lineup.
Yeah. And if there was one bedrock philosophy around which Moneyball was built, it was basically that. And that was, is it amazing that it took baseball that many years and decades to abandon batting average as one of the primary markers of player metrics and replace it with on-base percentage, which makes all the sense in the world because on-base percentage is more important than batting average because a walk is worth 1 base just the same as a hit is. But Billy Beane was the guy that did it, and he had such good success with it, like I said, that everybody has been imitating him for the last nearly 25 years now, and it is, I would say it has had an overall deleterious effect on the game because it has produced a standardization that I don't think is necessarily a good thing because now everybody wants to play Moneyball. Everybody wants to walk a lot and launch angle and exit velocity and all this shit that didn't even exist 15 or 20 years ago. Now it's the only thing scouts care about, but that's what human beings always do. They find a new thing they like and then they carry it way the hell too far and take it completely overboard. And then they realize, wow, maybe we've taken this completely overboard and we need to dial it back a little bit. And I think that's the point where baseball is kind of starting to get to, that maybe the Moneyball philosophy is a perfectly good and useful thing. Maybe it's better than what came before, but maybe it's not the all-encompassing be-all, end-all of how every ball club should be run. And I think the next 5 to 10 years will be interesting to see if that levels off anymore.
I think technology has changed it a lot too. And I don't mean just the technology in the bullpens and behind the scenes, but the technology of showing the games have become a bit so immediate, right? I mean, we've had TV for what, almost 100 years now. I mean, they were broadcasting radio games 140 years ago almost, however old the damn fucking thing is. The point is, it's always been a game that you participated in live, even as a voyeuristic experience. You are listening to it, you don't watch it. You watch it, you don't really listen to it. You can tune into a Tokyo game and mute the volume and understand what's going on without anybody having to explain it to you. And all of these things have changed the flavor of how baseball is received by the general public, especially in America. 1 second. The angles and whatnot that are used in television are now more framed up for online quick clips and hot clips and stuff like that, and no longer, part of a TV broadcast that's going to be sent out, on Wednesday afternoon to everybody. It's not a
Yep.
public performance in that way anymore. It's changed.
And it's endlessly fascinating to me that baseball had so much more cultural cachet in this country when it was impossible to watch the games except by attending in person, and extending that out to the perspective of the players themselves. I'm reminded again of Tony Gwynn, because in the early and mid 80s, when he first started winning his long string of batting titles, he was the first guy who ever studied his own at bats on video. He bought this ridiculous portable Betamax machine that he would take on the road with him, and he would have his wife Alicia back home in San Diego record the games on the VCR, and he would take the tapes on the road with him, and everybody made fun of him. Oh, Dr. Video, what the hell? What is this? Some kind of science experiment? He was the only guy in the world that did. And imagine that. This is well within our lifetime. This is barely even 40 years ago that a man is being mocked for using video to improve his performance. And naturally, because Tony Gwynn played here, the Padres became the first team to have their own dedicated video room. Nowadays, every team has not just a dedicated video room, but a dedicated video staff, probably a dozen people in most cases, who just work on that stuff that they made fun of Tony Gwynn for doing, when I was in grade school. And that's how quickly things change. And imagine making fun of a guy for using all the resources at his disposal to improve his performance. But they did. They mocked him relentlessly. They just made fun of him constantly for dragging that Betamax machine around with him. But you know what? Who the fuck won 8 batting titles and who didn't?
Thank you, Scotty Waddles. $1.49 super sticker for Captain Curmudgeon.
Boom. Thanks, buddy. You remain a legend.
Did you hear about the ranch dressing thing that they're doing? Hidden Valley is sending a couple of creators across Europe. And this is what reminded me is Big E 2020 says we're his favorite gay couple. And I was thinking,
we're my favorite gay couple too.
How would you like to travel across Europe with me and dump ranch on all of the cuisine? How do you feel about ranch?
Yeah, you should see the gay stuff we get up to when we're not on the air.
Right? Oh my Lord, they would just blush. Absolutely. So are we doing some Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon stuff?
Yeah, we can do some Dragon Lizard talk if you want to do some.
Have
Dragon
you watched
Lizard
The
talk.
Princess? Did you do your homework?
I have not. Oh damn! I didn't do my homework. I apologize.
How dare you, sir? All right, so House of the Dragon. The most recent episode that I'd come across was the 2 episodes immediately after the 10-year bump after she has when Alicent has the kids and whatnot.
Yeah.
One
the
Mrs.
one where the episode where they cold open on the childbirth.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Which was all very confusing because I didn't catch the 10-year jump and was trying to figure out who are these people.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a better way you could have done it to lessen the audience confusion. Because it's a weird thing you're trying to do, because you're age swapping half of your cast and not age swapping the rest of your cast. So the male characters just kind of retain the same general age and appearance for about 40 years, but the female characters have to be recast, and it creates for a confusing situation, especially when in season 1 you're depicting basically 30 or 40 years of narrative time, and in the second year, the second season is basically less than 2 weeks. So
the second season was supposed to be the actual what was it, Dance of Dragons, right? It was supposed to be all battles, like. So
yeah, we were supposed to get the Battle of the Gullet at the end of season 2, and then HBO decided, nah, We're not doing 10 episodes. We're doing 8 episodes instead, which it's hard to blame the showrunners and the people who work on the show for the season turning out the way it did because of, just stuff that was out of their control that was coming from up above. And I know the writers' strike had much to do with that too, but we are still within our rights to lament the deleterious effect that it had on the product. And it did have a very deleterious effect because one really gets a strong impression that we were supposed to have 2 more episodes, and now we're just kind of very quickly wrapping everything up in episode 8. And it also had the result that not really very much of consequence happened in the second season at all. So you kind of removed the big narrative anchor by chopping off those last 2 episodes, because normally, as we know in this franchise, in the A Song of Ice and Fire franchise, the second to last episode is where you get the big major battle, the crux of the matter. And then the final episode is the aftermath of that. So when you never even get to what was supposed to be the penultimate episode, you wind up with a season that is going to cause a lot of very negative feelings. And that's not
It's truncated.
Yeah.
It's not complete. It feels unfinished. Agreed. And not to beat a dead horse, but I'm still really angry that I didn't get my fight between the Fossaways. I just want to sit in the corner and pout, man, like drink my fucking sorrows away, because I wanted to see that shit and I wanted to see it up close, because I have a feeling that the Green Apple is going to just absolutely massacre that man. He wants some.
But you still have cause for hope, because there could be additional footage that they shot and didn't use, and they're planning to use it in flashback in the next season, because we've seen that this show, in rather a departure from the first 2 shows, is more willing to tell stories in flashback. So
right. Also, there's much more of a lean on the unreliable narrator in this as opposed to previous shows. Previous shows just kind of depict things happening, and they don't really give you a whole lot of room for interpreting what may actually. It's not a memory. It's not a story. It's not none of that shit. It's not a dream or a flashback. It's just the story that's going on. This show, or at least Night of the Seven Kingdoms, has a different flow to it. It does flashbacks, and because it does flashbacks, this introduces the concept of an unreliable narrator, which means Sir Arlen Long might not be so long, and Sir Duncan might not be so tall.
Right. And I'm glad they took that approach, because it proceeds out of the kind of book that Fire and Blood is, and it's a different kind of book from the main book series that Game of Thrones is based on, and the novella series that A Night of the Seven Kingdoms is based on, because Fire and Blood is presented as a historical document that is collated by a couple of maesters at the Citadel, and what's his name, Mushroom, who's the most unreliable narrator of all. So in much of that book, you've got 3 competing versions of things, and because that used to be the way that actual history was done for many, many decades and centuries, and it's kind of why your guess is as good as mine for the actual events of some pretty major episodes in human history, because it took quite a while for the discipline of history to develop to the point where we want to accurately write down the events that actually happened and not spin anything for political purposes, because you kind of back in the medieval days, you kind of had to spin things for political purposes, because let's keep in mind, it was a very money intensive, labor intensive process to have people write things down in the days when you don't have the printing press yet. If you want to write a history book, you've got to hire an entire staff of monks or friars or whoever, and buy them a whole bunch of really expensive supplies and have them write the thing. And if you're spending all that money to get that product made, then you're damn right you're going to tell those guys, hey, write it in a way that's favorable to me, because who's your benefactor right now? Who's giving you your job? I'm just saying, give daddy a little shout out once in a while. And that used to be the way that history was written for a very, 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 very long time. And it has the result that the events of our past are often hopelessly clouded in mystery, and that's really what George Martin was trying to get across when he wrote Fire and Blood. He was trying to make that, a simulacrum of how unreliable many of the recordings of history are, you know, going back to our pre-Gutenberg days. And I think it's a good device for him to use that helps people understand real world history in addition to the history of his fictional universe. And that's one of the things that I think makes him such an invaluable creator.
Well, we were discussing House of the Dragon, and until you get to the Dance of Dragons, which really kicks off post Gullet, you don't really have a solid war going on, right? You got a couple of skirmishes that are happening here and there and kind of everywhere. You have two sides of this family. And is it Maekar that dies? No, not him, the other guy. The dude who died, Viserys, maybe. The guy who dies and legitimizes all of his bastards.
Oh, that was shit.
Yeah, I know his name, but my tongue too. Baelor.
Yeah, the guy who legit. The guy who all the Blackfires.
Blackfires.
I'm gonna
some
have
of them. See, that's the thing. Is some of his kids were legitimate, and some of his kids were not legitimate. The legitimate ones gathered together and tried to execute all the illegitimate ones, and they had dragons too. Fuck.
Aegon the Fourth.
Oh, I was way off. I thought it was one of them Viserion, Valerian, Viserys, Viderian.
Yeah, I couldn't decide if it was one of the Aegons or not. And then, of course, Aegon the Fifth is the kid that we now know as little
Egg,
little Prince Egg. Yeah,
right. And so, there's definitely going to be some dragon shenanigans, and I kind of feel like their commitment to showing flying dragons is kind of what killed that show. In order to get enough special effects to make the dragons work, they had to make so many concessions in every other aspect of the show that it sort of aborted it before it got started.
Which is a hell of a damn shame, because I think everybody knows what my opinion is on that. I think this fictional universe is at its best when it downplays the supernatural shit as much as possible. I'm not saying downplay it totally, but I think the material is at its best when it is a fictionalized version of actual medieval European history. That's when I enjoy it the most. And when you get into Walking Dead people and big flying dragons, I'm not saying that isn't interesting. It's just less interesting for me than the stuff that is more firmly grounded in actual history.
So, during the time of Night of the Seven Kingdoms, there are no active dragons flying that I'm aware of. At that point, the dragons are all small mutated creatures that aren't that are basically kept as pets.
Yeah, they're basically chihuahuas at that point.
Yeah, they've become pugs.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yep.
Something that struggles to breathe on its own.
Uh-huh.
I don't care how cute that is. That is a deformity, people. Stop producing those things.
Yeah. And it's not cute anyway, so just stop.
Well, yeah, there's that too. But you think it's cute. I disagree. And I'm right. You're wrong. Stop making them.
I don't have the faintest idea how anybody can look at a pug and say, "Oh, what a cute dog."
Now,
it's beyond me. I'm sorry.
I have come across a few very charming pugs, right? They're good dogs. It's not their fault that they're little mutant monsters.
Well, yeah.
Did you ever watch any of the like Living Dead films specifically? I think it was Revenge of the Living Dead Part 2. No, I'm totally off base. It was fucking House 2. On House 2, they did the adventure back to the Wild West days with the alien worm from the parallel universe. Do you remember the little puppy dog worm caterpillar thing?
No, I'm gonna have to take your word for it.
Oh, dude, if you haven't seen House 2, go check it out. It's a damn hoot, bro. I can't. I've been trying for years to make a headcanon analogy of what's actually happening in the film, because I'm one of those people who ruin films by going, "Oh, head injury. This is all some kind of psychotic episode because of a brain hemorrhage," right? He's just dying and kicking out on the floor over there, or bad water, bad air. It's always in the cabin that has a well under the floorboards in the basement or something like that, and but with House, it's alcoholism. Whenever you watch the movie, he shows up with the intention of getting clean, and it's obviously alcohol that he's trying to get clean from, and then all the weirdness starts through his demens tremens and everything. With House 2, I think it's heroin, but I can't prove it. I don't think they had that much of a plan when making the movie. I think the movie was made as a cash grab, and they just got really, really, really lucky that it was.
Or the only plan was let's upgrade from alcohol to heroin.
I know. I mean, I don't think that was taken into account. It wasn't an analogy for anything, and that's why I can't find an analogy to hang it on, right? Whereas the first House, we spent years in production trying to get made. The second House got signed immediately. So anyway, it's an excellent film. If you get a chance to go watch them both. The first one's kind of hokey, but the second one, like I said, it benefited from having some very early big name actors before they had actually had a chance to show their chops. And I can't remember who they are off the top of my head, but you'll recognize most of the people in that film. Even the guy who gets shot and knocked over the freaking balustrade. That's like Eddie Guerrero or some shit like that. I can't remember.
Oh, Latino heat. You had to bring Eddie Guerrero into this.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's somebody. I can't remember who it is, but there's some random extra that gets like sprayed with a M16 or something and falls over a balcony and then disappears. You never see the body. He never shows up again in the movie at all. He's just a random dead guy. And I can't remember who he is, but he's like either a wrestler or a baseball player or an actor or something like that.
But since we're on the subject of bloodbaths, and you brought up the name of Eddie Guerrero, have you ever seen I believe it's the Great American Bash 2004 match, Eddie Guerrero versus JBL, when he does the worst botched blade job of all time and basically leaves a couple gallons of blood inside there? It's the most horrifying wrestling match anybody has ever seen in their entire life.
Was that a cage match?
No, it was just a regular old match, but the spot was that he took a chair shot and was just supposed to, do a normal blade job, but he bladed way that he was just gushing, pumping, like for the next 15 minutes of the match. Like it's the most I've seen it one time. I could never go back and watch it again because it's that horrifying. It is the actual moment where pro wrestling turns into a horror movie. I can't imagine they would let the match finish today with the match. Like it was pulsating out of his head, like boom, boom, and the ring afterward. My God, it wasn't even the last match of the night. Other guys had to go in and work matches in the same ring afterward. And
yeah,
do I wonder why wrestlers get so many staph infections? No, I do not. But that's only one of the horrifying aspects of that, and that's. Since you mentioned Eddie Guerrero, I guess I had to bring that up.
The one that gets me was I can't remember if it was Sting or Ultimate Warrior that was in the cage match that caught his face against the chain link after blading. He had like a tiny little cut on his forehead, and it wasn't nothing really to worry about. He was like, "Oh no, look, I'm bleeding." Yeah. And then they did like the bounce into the ring rope, and his head went just a little bit too far and caught the edge of that chain link and just laid that freaking blade job open. And the next thing you know, it looked like somebody got a fucking slasher film out there. They had to go to commercial and shit. They brought people in to clean the fucking ring. They were steam jobbing the motherfucker over there going, "We wouldn't mean for that. That shouldn't happen on national television."
Yeah.
My mom got upset.
Thanks for bringing your kids to the bloodbath, ladies and gentlemen. We hope you had a good time.
Absolutely. Remember, we'll be here again next week if you want to catch some more fucking hepatitis.
Same bat time, same staph infection channel.
But hey, it's they're athletes. Damn it, they're not actors. I'm kind
I
of
just wish
surprised
they.
there aren't more actors from wrestling.
Yeah, you know what I would like to see a return to is, and I guess we have to get on the subject of WrestleMania if we're going to talk about this, because I don't know if you've heard, but ticket sales for WrestleMania, which is 4 weeks away, very very soft. They just dropped the prices for the second time, I think. The A couple weeks ago, the least expensive ticket for either night was something like $430, and now it's about $170 because they were really lagging behind the ticket sales they had last year. I think much of that probably has to do with don't have the event in the same venue 2 years in a row. But I think it has much more to do with the fact that they're kind of fleecing the customers and the product isn't all that good presently. And yet you can't do that stuff without kind of making people angry. Because look, Vince McMahon may be a horrible human being. He might be responsible for more sins and misdeeds than plenty average human beings, but there's one thing that Vince McMahon always understood, and that is that I need to have people be able to bring their families to the show my company does, because that is how we build a generational audience. But since they've been taken over by TKO and are now run by, a corporate board, and instead of just an impresario, then it is all about revenue maximization now. And just, if you can get $450 for the cheapest seat in the house, then god damn it, you charge $450 for that seat. And I guess you can get away with doing business like that for a while, but you can't get away with doing business like that long term. And that's the lesson that they are beginning to learn right now. And it's probably a lesson that is long overdue.
It's like taxation. But the logic behind it would imply that the higher you tax someone, the more money you'll get. But in reality, what happens is you raise the tax rate and a couple of people leave. And you raise tax rate a little bit more and a few more people leave. And then the third time you raise it, a whole shitload of people leave, and you look up and realize you're actually bringing in less money than you would be bringing in if you charged less for taxes and tax more people.
And that is the aspect of the thing that the tax and spend crowd can never get their heads around. They imagine that the potential pool of tax revenue is just sitting there and is constant and is static, and we just take as much as we want out of it. But it's still going to stay the same. We can go back and take more out if we want. But no, that's not the way any of this works. When you jack that thing up, people leave. They take themselves away. They take their businesses away. When you jack up taxes, you reduce your taxable pool that you're assuming is static and always going to remain the same. And the same thing always happens, but they still keep trying new and stupider versions of it. And the result is always the same. And yeah.
I think it has partly to do with a misguided sense of civic pride that our city is the bestest city in the world. No one would ever leave it for any reason except I'm going to raise the taxes and they're going to leave. And then only the people who are either trapped by their circumstances or trapped by their job are going to still be here. They're going to be forced to pay the taxes. They have no choice because that's why they're there. They have no choice.
Well, and the fact also remains that we still have yet to hear a good explanation from anyone for how transferring large amounts of money out of the private sector into the government sector makes life better for the average person, because it doesn't. All it does is grow government, make more government jobs, and make more lavish government benefit packages. But nobody on the tax and spend crowd ever wants to talk about that aspect of it, because they don't understand how any of this works. They just don't.
Velcro. Didn't the government have something to do with Velcro?
Jesus, is that time already for me to do the thing that we do when we do the thing that we do? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining us here on the Blast Radius tonight. I didn't get any live score updates in the chat as I hoped I would, but I will I will be kind enough to forgive you for that right now. Hope you enjoyed the baseball monologue. Hope you enjoyed our witty, pithy banter for the remainder of the show. I didn't expect to take up the entire first half of the show with that monologue. It came out a little bit longer than I expected. Yes, that is what she said. But setting that aside, thank you for joining us anyway. You're the reason why we do this. Thank you for the super chats and the super stickers and the other super things that you send. They are always very, very much appreciated. We hope you have a fantastic Monday and an edifying Tuesday and a very fulfilling, exciting remainder of your week. We will see you next Sunday, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific, as we always do. Have a good one. See you next time. Get off my lawn.
This one's for you, buddy. Nice.